She was raised not to touch, not to desire, not to dream of anything beyond what was allowed. But when she saw the millionaire stepping out of the pool, her body reacted before her soul could understand. If you enjoy stories of love and romance, watch until the end, subscribe to this channel, and leave a comment telling us where you're listening from. We continue. Silence had always been the language of Isabella's home, a silence that weighed heavily on the antique furniture, on the perpetually drawn curtains, on the measured gestures of a mother who spoke more with God than with her own daughter. On that September morning, the air was heavy with humidity and unfulfilled promises, as Isabella folded her few clothes into a small, worn suitcase. At 21, she had never slept away from home, never made a decision without consulting her mother, never even imagined that a world might exist beyond those walls, yellowed by time and resignation. The opportunity came through Mrs. Shelby, a neighborhood lady who attended the same church as her mother. There was a temporary position at a property in the mountains of Pinecrest, a simple job of outdoor cleaning that would pay well and last only a few weeks. Isabella's mother, Ruth, hesitated for days, not because she worried about her daughter, but because she feared that exposure to the outside world might contaminate the purity she so zealously guarded. But the money was necessary, and the faith that God would protect her innocent girl spoke louder. During the bus journey winding through the Colorado mountains, Isabella pressed her face against the foggy window, watching the landscape transform. Gray buildings gave way to spacious houses, which then became imposing mansions surrounded by high walls and electronic gates. The green intensified with each curve, and the air even inside the vehicle seemed cleaner, freer. She felt something strange in her chest, a vibration she couldn't name, as if she were approaching something she had always known existed, but never had the courage to seek. The property was at the end of a dirt road, hidden among century-old eucalyptus trees that formed a kind of natural tunnel. When the gate opened automatically, Isabella felt a shiver run down her spine. The house was immense, with modern architecture blended with classic elements, built entirely of stone and glass, as if it wanted to simultaneously hide and display itself in the landscape. There was something disturbing about the perfection of that place, a beauty that bothered her, that seemed to hide secrets behind each mirrored window. Mrs. Shelby received her at the back entrance, quickly explaining the rules. Isabella was to clean only the outdoor area, the veranda surrounding the pool, the lounges, the wrought-iron tables. Nothing more. Under no circumstances was she to enter the house or address the owner. Mr. Victor Caldwell values his privacy above all else, the lady explained, and any transgression would result in immediate dismissal. There was something in Mrs. Shelby's tone, a mixture of respect and fear, that made Isabella swallow hard. The first day passed without incident. Isabella worked in silence, focused on each movement, trying not to look at the house windows that seemed to be watching her. The pool was enormous, with infinity edges that blended with the mountain horizon. The water was crystal clear, but there was something unsettling about the way it reflected the light, creating patterns that seemed to move even when there was no wind. During the entire time, she saw no shadow of the owner, but she felt a constant presence, as if someone was watching her from inside the house. It was on the second day that everything changed. The sky was heavy, heralding the typical afternoon storm of the region. Isabella was finishing sweeping the leaves that had fallen during the night when she heard the sound of water breaking behind her. Instinctively, she turned, and the world seemed to stop. A man emerged from the pool like an apparition, water running down his bare torso, defined muscles glistening under the diffused afternoon light. His black hair was plastered to his face, framing features that seemed carved in marble. But it was his eyes that completely paralyzed her, dark as a moonless night, filled with an intensity that made her feel as if she were being stripped from within. Victor Caldwell didn't smile when he saw her. He showed no surprise or embarrassment at being observed. He simply stared at her with that disturbing intensity, as if he had recognized her from some forgotten dream. Isabella felt the blood boiling in her veins, a completely new and terrifying sensation. Her legs trembled, and she needed to lean on the broom to avoid falling. She had never seen a man like that, had never felt that mixture of fascination and terror that now completely consumed her. He got out of the pool with feline movements, grabbed a towel and began to dry himself without taking his eyes off her. There was something predatory in that gaze, but also a vulnerability she couldn't decipher. The scars that marked his chest and arms told stories she dared not imagine. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep and hoarse, as if it hadn't been used for a long time. "You're new here," he said, more as a statement than a question. Isabella tried to respond, but the words refused to come out. She just nodded, feeling her cheeks burn with embarrassment and something else she couldn't name. Victor took a few steps in her direction, and she could smell the chlorinated water mixed with something more masculine, more disturbing. "What's your name?" he asked, and this time there was a softness in his voice that completely disarmed her. "Isabella," she managed to murmur, surprising herself with the sound of her own voice. Victor repeated the name slowly, as if savoring each syllable, and something in the way he pronounced it made her heart race uncontrollably. There was recognition in that look, as if he already knew who she was before even asking, as if he had been waiting for her for a long time. That night, Isabella couldn't sleep. The small room that Mrs. Shelby had prepared for her in the guest house seemed suffocating. The walls seemed to close in on her restless body. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that man emerging from the water again, saw the dark eyes that seemed to see through her soul. Her body reacted in ways she didn't understand, waves of heat coursing through her skin, and she found herself touching her own lips, imagining what it would be like to be touched by those hands she had seen holding the towel with such naturalness. By morning, she tried to concentrate on work, but her hands trembled as she cleaned the wrought-iron tables. With each movement, her eyes inevitably turned to the windows of the main house, looking for some sign of life, some shadow that indicated his presence. The silence was absolute, but she felt she was being watched, as if each of her gestures was being recorded and analyzed by those disturbing eyes. It was when she was arranging the cushions on the loungers that she encountered him again. This time he was dressed, wearing a white linen shirt that accentuated his tanned skin and dark pants that marked his imposing silhouette. He carried a cup of coffee in his hands and walked in her direction with deliberate steps, like a predator who had carefully chosen his prey. "You seem nervous," he observed, stopping a few meters away. There was an almost imperceptible smile playing at the corners of his mouth, but his eyes remained serious, calculating. Isabella swallowed hard, trying to find her voice. "No, sir," she managed to murmur, but they both knew it was a lie. Victor chuckled softly, a deep sound that made something contract in her stomach. "Call me Victor," he said, taking another step in her direction. "Sir makes it seem like I'm very old, and you very young." The way he said it, loaded with double meaning, made Isabella blush violently. She lowered her eyes, unable to sustain that gaze that seemed to see much more than it should. "How old are you, Isabella?" he asked, and she noticed how her name sounded different when pronounced by that velvety voice. 21, she replied, still avoiding looking at him directly. "Very young," he murmured, more to himself than to her. Too young to be alone in a place like this. There was something in the way he said it that sent a chill down Isabella's spine. There was danger in those words, but also a strange protection, as if he were simultaneously warning her and claiming her for himself. "You're afraid of me," he continued, and this time it wasn't a question. "You should be," he added, taking another step, now so close that she could feel the heat emanating from his body. "Why?" she managed to ask, finally finding the courage to look him in the eyes. What she saw there left her breathless. There was a darkness in those eyes, a deep pain that seemed to consume everything around, but there was also desire, a desire so intense that she felt her legs weaken. "Because I'm not a good man, Isabella," he replied, his voice dropping to a whisper that made her skin tingle. "Because I've caused a lot of suffering to people who didn't deserve it, and because you remind me of someone I lost a long time ago." There was a vulnerability in those words that surprised her. For a moment she glimpsed the man behind the mask, someone who carried scars much deeper than those marking his body. Without thinking, she extended her hand, almost touching his arm, but stopped at the last moment. Victor noticed the gesture, and something changed in his expression, a flash of surprise followed by something that seemed almost gratitude. "Would you like to see the house?" he asked suddenly, completely changing the direction of the conversation. Isabella hesitated. Mrs. Shelby had been very clear about not entering the property, but there was something in the way Victor looked at her that made it impossible to refuse. "Just for a few minutes," he insisted. "There are things in there you should see." Against all her better judgment, she nodded. Victor then smiled, a genuine smile that completely transformed his face, making her realize how beautiful he must have been before being marked by whatever tragedy haunted him. He extended his hand to her, and when their fingers touched, an electric current ran up her arm, making her gasp softly. The house inside was even more impressive than outside. The spaces were ample, decorated with a refined taste that mixed modern pieces with antiques. But there was something strange in the atmosphere, as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for something that never arrived. The curtains were closed in most rooms, creating a dimness that should have been cozy, but somehow seemed threatening. Victor guided her through the corridors in silence, occasionally lightly touching her back to indicate the direction. Each touch was like fire against her skin, even through the fabric of her dress. She noticed that he avoided certain doors, passing by them quickly as if they hid secrets he wasn't yet ready to reveal. It was when they reached the library that Isabella felt something strange. The room was magnificent, with shelves that went from floor to ceiling filled with old books, leather armchairs that seemed to embrace whoever sat in them, and a fireplace that probably heated the entire space during winter. But there was something familiar about that place, as if she had been there before, as if she already knew where to find each book, each object. "Do you like to read?" Victor asked, observing her reaction. "Very much," she answered, running her fingers over the spines of the books with reverence. "My mother didn't approve of most books, but I always found a way to get some hidden." Victor chuckled softly. "And what would your mother say if she knew you were here now?" he asked, approaching behind her. Isabella felt the heat of his body against her back and needed to lean on the bookshelf to avoid falling. "She would probably say I'm walking straight into hell," she murmured, surprising herself with her own boldness. "Maybe she's right," Victor whispered in her ear, his hot breath making her shiver all over. "Maybe we both are." The following days became a dangerous dance between approach and resistance. Victor always appeared at the end of the afternoon, when the sun began to hide behind the mountains, bringing with him a cup of tea that he offered to Isabella with a smile she was learning to decipher. There were layers to that smile, some sweet as honey, others sharp as blades. She began to wait for these moments with an anxiety that frightened her, constantly checking the clock and fixing her hair whenever she heard footsteps approaching. During these evening conversations, Victor revealed fragments of himself, like someone distributing crumbs to a wild bird. He talked about his business, a technology company he had built from nothing after his parents' death in a car accident when he was only 25. He mentioned travels around the world, exotic places she only knew through photographs in old magazines. But when the subject approached more personal matters, especially about his deceased wife, he closed up like an oyster, his eyes darkening in a way that made Isabella realize there were territories in his soul where she still had no permission to enter. It was on a Thursday that the dreams began. Isabella woke up in the middle of the night with her heart racing, her skin covered in cold sweat, and the disturbing sensation that she had been in that house before, long before accepting the job. In the dream, she walked through the corridors of the mansion, but everything seemed different. The walls were lighter, there were fresh flowers in the vases, laughter echoed through the rooms, and there was a man, not Victor, but someone with familiar features who followed her through the rooms, whispering her name, with a voice she recognized but couldn't place. The most disturbing thing was that, in the dream, she wasn't herself. She wore different clothes, more elegant, and moved through the house with the familiarity of someone who knows every corner, every secret. There was a pool, but not the same one she cleaned every day. This one was empty, cracked with dry leaves accumulated at the bottom, and beside it, a female silhouette who cried silently, repeating words in Latin that Isabella couldn't understand upon waking, but that in the dream made perfect sense. The next morning she was visibly shaken. Victor immediately noticed the change in her behavior, the way her hands trembled as she held the broom, how her eyes constantly darted to the windows of the house, as if expecting to see something that shouldn't be there. "You slept poorly," he observed, approaching with that feline form that had already become familiar. It wasn't a question. "I had strange dreams," admitted Isabella, surprising herself with her own honesty. "About this house, about people I've never seen, but who seem to know me." Victor stood completely still for a moment, something changing in his expression. "What kind of dreams?" he asked, his voice loaded with a tension she couldn't interpret. She hesitated before answering, feeling that she was about to cross an invisible line. I dreamed that I knew this house before it was as it is now. There was a man, not you, but someone similar, and a woman who cried beside an empty pool. Victor turned pale, his fists closing involuntarily. For a moment, Isabella feared she had said something terrible, but then he moved even closer, his dark eyes studying her with a new intensity. "Describe the man," he ordered, his voice low and urgent. Isabella closed her eyes, trying to recover the details that were already beginning to dissipate like smoke. He was taller than you, with lighter hair. He had calloused hands as if he worked with them. "And there was a scar here," she said, unconsciously touching her own forehead. A small scar, almost hidden by the hair. The silence that followed was deafening. Victor stared at her as if she were a ghost, as if her words had invoked something he desperately tried to forget. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse, laden with a pain that made Isabella's heart tighten. "You describe my gardener," he said, "a man who worked here more than 20 years ago, a man who disappeared without a trace." The revelation fell between them like a silent bomb. Isabella felt the world spin around her, the pieces of a puzzle beginning to fit together in a disturbing way. "What was his name?" she managed to ask, though she already feared the answer. "Michael Sanders," Victor replied, observing every change in her expression. "A good man, trustworthy, until the day he simply vanished." The surname hit Isabella like a punch to the stomach. Sanders. The same surname she carried, that her mother had always refused to explain completely. There was always something evasive when she asked about her father, always a change of subject followed by fervent prayers. "My father," she whispered, more to herself than to Victor. "My father's name was Michael Sanders." The confession transformed the atmosphere between them. Victor now stared at her with a mixture of fascination and horror, as if she were simultaneously the answer to his questions and the source of new nightmares. "That's impossible," he murmured, but his words sounded empty even to himself. The coincidences were too many to be ignored, the details too specific to be explained by imagination. That night, Victor invited Isabella to dinner in the main house. She knew she should refuse, that she was getting involved in something dangerous, but the need for answers spoke louder than prudence. The table was set elegantly, with candles that created dancing shadows on the walls, and a bottle of wine that he opened with precise movements. During the meal, he told more about Michael Sanders, how he had arrived at the property looking for work, how he quickly became indispensable, taking care not only of the gardens, but assuming other responsibilities, how his wife, Helen, had developed a special friendship with him, spending hours talking about plants, about life, about dreams that she had never shared even with her husband. There was something in the way Victor spoke about this friendship that bothered Isabella. A tension in the words, a barely disguised resentment that suggested that relationship had become something more complex than just employer and employee. "My wife was a lonely woman," he explained, refilling the wine glass again. "I traveled a lot in those days, building the business. Perhaps I neglected her emotional needs." "And then," asked Isabella, gathering courage, "what happened to her?" Victor was silent for a long moment, his eyes lost in the flames of the candles. When he finally spoke, his voice was laden with a guilt that seemed to consume him from within. "She drowned in the pool on a stormy night. The body was found the next morning, and Michael disappeared the same day. No one ever heard from him again." The story echoed in Isabella's mind like a disturbing echo. There was something there that didn't close, pieces that didn't fit perfectly. But before she could ask more questions, Victor rose abruptly, approaching her with an intensity that made her heart race. "You're meddling with things that should remain buried," he whispered, his hands gently touching her face. "But I can't let you go away." Victor's touch on her face was like a flame that awakened something dormant inside Isabella. She closed her eyes, feeling her skin burn where his fingers touched her, her heart beating so hard she was sure he could hear it. When she opened her eyes again, she found him so close she could feel his breath against her lips. There was a silent struggle happening in his eyes, desire and resistance waging a battle she could see reflected in the dark depths of his gaze. "I should send you away," he murmured, but his hands moved to her hair, his fingers tangling in the brown strands as if it were impossible to move away. "You're dangerous for me, Isabella, more dangerous than you imagine." But instead of moving away, he leaned even closer, his lips almost touching hers. The air between them was charged with electricity, with unspoken promises and a desire that grew with each second. It was Isabella who closed the final distance, pressing her lips against his in a kiss that was both innocent and devastating. She had never kissed anyone before, but there was an urgency in her movements that surprised them both. Victor responded with an intensity that left her dizzy, his hands moving to her waist, pulling her against his body with a need that seemed to consume all his resistance. The kiss deepened, becoming more urgent, more desperate. Isabella felt as if she were drowning and being saved at the same time, each touch awakening sensations she didn't even know existed. Victor's hands traveled across her back, leaving trails of fire wherever they passed, and she heard herself moaning softly against his lips, a sound that made her blush intensely. It was Victor who pulled away first, breathless, his dark eyes shining with a mixture of desire and something that seemed almost fear. "This can't happen," he said, running his hands through his hair in an attempt to regain control. "You don't know what you're doing, Isabella. You don't know who you're getting involved with." "But I want to know," she replied, surprising herself with the firmness of her own voice. "I want to understand you, Victor. I want to understand what happened here, what happened to my father. I want to understand why I feel I belong to this place, even knowing I should run away." Isabella's confession seemed to break something inside Victor. He moved away, walking to the window that overlooked the pool, his hands resting on the glass as if he needed some physical barrier between them. For a long moment, he was silent, observing the dark waters that reflected the moonlight. When he finally spoke, his voice was laden with a deep sadness. "Helen used to say the same thing," he murmured, "that she felt she belonged to this place, even when everything conspired to keep her away. She had nightmares, strange dreams about the property's past, about people who lived here before us. She said that sometimes she woke up with the feeling that there were other women in the house, women who had suffered, who had been lost." Victor turned to face her, and Isabella saw tears glistening in his eyes. "I thought it was just her imagination," he continued. "Helen was always sensitive, emotional, but after she died, after Michael disappeared, I began to notice things, objects that moved places, doors that opened by themselves, whispers in the middle of the night. And now you appear with the same dreams, the same sensations, talking about things you shouldn't know." The revelation sent a chill down Isabella's spine. There was something in that house, something that went beyond Helen's death and her father's disappearance. There was an older, darker story that seemed to call certain women to itself. "Show me her room," she asked, ignoring the voice of reason that screamed for her to flee that place. Victor hesitated, but something in Isabella's determination convinced him. He guided her up the spiral staircase to the second floor, passing through corridors she recognized from her dreams. The door to the master bedroom was closed, and when Victor opened it, a slightly sweet floral perfume escaped from the room. The bedroom was preserved exactly as Helen had left it, with clothes still hanging in the closet and beauty products organized on the dressing table, but it was the desk in the corner that caught Isabella's attention. There were papers scattered over it, unfinished letters, and in the center a red leather-bound diary. She approached, as if attracted by a magnetic force, her fingers touching the smooth surface of the leather. "May I?" she asked, looking at Victor. He nodded reluctantly, as if he knew there was no turning back. The first pages of the diary were normal. Everyday accounts about the weather, about the house chores, about the loneliness Helen felt in her husband's absence. But as Isabella advanced in the reading, the tone changed, becoming more restless, more disturbed. Helen wrote about strange dreams, about the feeling of being watched, about conversations with Michael that seemed to awaken in her memories that were not her own. It was in an entry dated 3 months before her death that Isabella found something that made her blood freeze. Helen wrote about a discovery she had made in the property's archives, old documents that revealed a dark history. The house had been built on the ruins of a colonial farm, where young women had mysteriously disappeared over the centuries, always women between 20 and 25 years old, always of humble origin, always connected in some way to the men who took care of the property. "Michael showed me the photographs today," Isabella read aloud, her voice trembling. "They all look like me, all with the same dark eyes, the same brown hair. It's as if there's a pattern, as if this land chooses its victims. He says I should leave, that it's not safe for me to stay here. But how can I leave Victor? How can I abandon him when I know he too is a prisoner of this curse?" Victor had approached, reading over Isabella's shoulder. His breathing was irregular, his hands trembling. "I never saw these documents," he murmured. Helen never told me about these discoveries. Why would she hide something so important? Isabella continued reading, and the answer came in the following pages. Helen had discovered that Victor was not just the current owner of the house, but a descendant of a lineage of men who had owned that land for generations. Men who had become involved with these mysterious women. Men who had lost their loved ones in tragic and inexplicable ways. The curse seemed to follow the Caldwell family, repeating the same pattern of love and loss generation after generation. The last entry in the diary was unfinished, written in a hasty and desperate handwriting. "Michael came to get me today at dawn," it said. "He discovered something terrible about Victor, about his family, about what really happened to the other women. He says I need to flee tonight before it's too late, but I can't simply leave without confronting Victor, without giving him a chance to explain. Maybe together we can break this cycle. Maybe we can find a way to—" The sentence was left halfway, as if Helen had been interrupted in the middle of writing. Isabella looked at Victor, who was as pale as a ghost. "She died that same night," he whispered, "and Michael disappeared. Now I understand why he never came back. He knew what was going to happen. He tried to save her, but he couldn't." The silence that followed was laden with disturbing implications. Isabella felt the weight of the history of that place, the sensation of being about to repeat a cycle that had perpetuated itself for centuries. But unlike Helen, she wasn't alone in this discovery. She had Victor by her side, and there was something in the way he looked at her that suggested that this time would be different, that together they could face whatever curse haunted that property. That dawn, Isabella couldn't return to the guest house. The revelations from Helen's diary had created a storm in her mind, and she found herself walking through the corridors of the mansion like a sleepwalker, trying to process everything she had discovered. Victor followed her at a respectful distance, as if understanding that she needed space to digest the disturbing information that had emerged from the past. It was when she passed by the library that something caught her attention. One of the bookshelves seemed slightly misaligned, as if it had been moved recently. Without thinking, she pushed the heavy structure and discovered that it moved with surprising ease, revealing a hidden passage behind it. Victor approached quickly, an expression of genuine surprise stamped on his face. "I didn't know this existed," he said, turning on his cell phone flashlight to illuminate the dark space. The passage led to a small room that seemed to have been used as a secret office. There was an old desk covered with papers, photographs scattered on the walls, and files organized on improvised shelves. The air was stale, laden with the smell of old paper and secrets kept for a long time. The photographs on the walls told a disturbing visual story. They were portraits of young women, all with physical characteristics similar to Isabella and Helen. Dark hair, deep eyes, expressions that mixed innocence and melancholy. Each photograph had a date handwritten on the back, and the dates spread over more than a century. 1890, 1923, 1956, 1978, 1995, and the most recent, from 2003, showed Helen smiling timidly at the camera. "Michael was documenting everything," murmured Victor, picking up one of the files from the shelf. "He discovered the pattern long before us." Isabella approached, reading over his shoulder. The file contained death certificates, clippings from old newspapers, police reports. All the women had died young, always in apparently accidental ways. Drownings, falls, fires. But there were details that suggested something more sinister. "Each of them had become romantically involved with men from the Caldwell family," continued Victor, his voice becoming tenser with each page he turned. "And all died shortly after discovering something about the property's history. It's as if there was a force trying to protect some ancestral secret." At the bottom of the file, Isabella found a folder marked with her own name. Her hands trembled as she opened it, revealing documents that completely changed her understanding of her own origin. There was a birth certificate different from the one she knew, showing that she had been born not in the city where she grew up, but in a clinic near the property. More shocking still, there was a paternity test, confirming that Michael Sanders was indeed her father, and a medical document indicating that her biological mother was not Ruth, but a woman named Carmen Valdez. Carmen had been an employee at the Caldwell house, working as a housekeeper when Victor was still a teenager. According to the documents, she had become pregnant by Michael and given birth to Isabella in secret, but died in childbirth due to complications. Michael, desperate and fearing for his daughter's safety, had given the baby to Ruth, a religious woman who had lost a young daughter and was willing to raise Isabella as her own. The impact of the revelation was devastating. Isabella sank to the floor, trying to assimilate that her whole life had been based on well-intentioned lies. Ruth was not her biological mother. Michael was indeed her father, and she had been born on that property that now felt like her home in ways that finally made sense. Victor knelt beside her, his hands gently touching her shoulders. "Now I understand why you feel connected to this place," he said softly. "You were born here, grew up hearing stories about this place through the collective unconscious of the region. Your connection isn't supernatural, it's ancestral." But there were more documents in the folder, and as Isabella examined them, an even more disturbing truth emerged. Michael hadn't just disappeared on the night of Helen's death. He had been murdered, his body hidden somewhere on the property. And the person responsible for the death wasn't a stranger or some mystical force. It was someone very close, someone who had discovered the relationship between Michael and Helen and couldn't accept the betrayal. Victor remained in absolute silence when Isabella read aloud the last document in the folder, a letter that Michael had written to her shortly before dying. In the letter, he confessed to having fallen in love with Helen, but denied any physical relationship. He said they had become confidants, that she had found in him the emotional support she didn't receive from her husband. But there was someone watching, someone who misinterpreted the nature of that friendship and decided to take drastic measures. "Helen discovered who killed Michael," continued Isabella, reading. "That's why she died. She confronted the killer and paid with her life." Michael ends the letter revealing that he had hidden evidence of the crime in a location that only Isabella would know how to find, following clues that he had left specifically for her in case something happened to him. The clues were encoded in the letter itself, subtle references to locations on the property that he had described to Carmen during her pregnancy, stories that she had later told to Ruth, who had repeated them to Isabella as fairy tales during her childhood. The century-old oak with the carved heart, the garden of white roses where birds never landed, the dry fountain where children made wishes. Isabella rose determined, wiping away tears she hadn't realized she'd shed. "I need to find this evidence," she said. "I need to know the truth about what happened to my father, about who killed Helen." Victor tried to protest, arguing that it was dangerous, that the killer might still be around, but she was resolute. "You don't understand," she said, facing him with an intensity that surprised him. "It's not just about justice for the dead. If we don't discover the truth, if we don't confront whoever did this, I'll be next. The pattern will repeat, and this time it will be with me." The logic was irrefutable, and Victor knew it. He nodded slowly, but there was something in his expression that Isabella couldn't completely decipher. It was fear, certainly, but there was also a strange resignation, as if he already knew what truth they would find. Together, they left the secret passage and walked across the property under the moonlight. The first location indicated by Michael's letter was the century-old oak, an immense tree that stood at the boundary between the house and the forest. Isabella remembered the stories that Ruth told about a magic tree where true loves carved their names, and when they reached the spot, they indeed found a heart carved into the trunk. Inside the hollow heart, there was a small waterproof container holding photographs and documents. The images showed Helen and Michael together, but in a clearly platonic way. Conversing in the garden, her crying while he offered a handkerchief, the two examining documents about the dark history of the property. There was nothing romantic or sexual in the images, just two people sharing a heavy emotional burden. But the last photograph was like a punch to Isabella's stomach. It showed someone watching them from a distance, hidden behind a tree. The figure was partially obscured by shadows, but it was clearly a man, and there was something familiar in the posture, in the way of hiding. When Isabella turned the photograph over, she found a notation from Michael. "He's been watching us for weeks. I'm afraid of what he might do if he discovers the documents." Victor had approached to see the photograph, and when the moonlight illuminated his expression, Isabella saw something that chilled her to the bone. It wasn't surprise or confusion, it was recognition. And when he realized she had noticed his reaction, something completely changed in his posture. The mask of vulnerability and affection fell, revealing something much darker underneath. "You shouldn't have found this," he said, his voice assuming a tone she had never heard before. Cold, calculating, dangerous. "It would have been better if you had stayed with your doubts, Isabella. It would have been better if you had left when you still had a chance." The air between them became as dense as lead. Isabella felt every muscle in her body tense as she observed the complete transformation in the man she thought she knew. Victor was no longer the vulnerable and tormented man who had conquered her with his pain and mystery. He was a predator who had finally revealed his fangs, and she was the prey who had voluntarily walked into his trap. "You," she whispered, the realization hitting her like an avalanche. "It was you who killed my father. It was you who killed Helen." Victor didn't deny it, just smiled in a way that made Isabella's blood freeze in her veins. It was a smile she now recognized. She had glimpsed fragments of it during their conversations, but had interpreted it as charm or seduction. Now she saw the truth behind that mask. "I didn't want to," he said, taking a step in her direction, making her instinctively back away. "But they forced me." Helen was obsessed with these stories about the property, about the women who died here. She couldn't leave the past in peace. "And your father," he encouraged her, fed her paranoia, made her doubt me. Victor's voice was strangely calm, as if he were explaining something obvious to a child. There was a coldness in that tone that was more frightening than any angry shout. Isabella continued backing away, trying to maintain distance, but he matched her step for step, like a cat playing with a mouse. "Helen discovered about the other women," he continued, his dark eyes gleaming under the moonlight. "She found documents that my great-grandfather had hidden, letters confessing the murders. My family has a problem, Isabella, an obsession. We fall in love with specific women, women with very particular characteristics, and when they try to leave us, when they threaten to expose our secrets, we can't control our reaction." The confession was delivered with a disturbing naturalness, as if he were describing a harmless genetic peculiarity. Isabella felt nausea rising in her throat, finally understanding the full extent of the curse that had haunted that property for generations. It wasn't supernatural. It was much worse. It was human. It was a lineage of men who had transformed love into possession, and possession into murder. "My father tried to save her," Isabella managed to say, her voice coming out as a strangled whisper. "He tried to make Helen flee." Victor nodded as if praising her deduction. "Exactly. Michael realized what I was, recognized the signs. He had worked for my family long enough to know the stories, to understand the pattern, so he decided to interfere." The anger in Victor's voice when mentioning Michael was palpable, years of resentment boiling beneath the seemingly controlled surface. "He convinced Helen that I was dangerous, that she should flee with him that same night. They had everything planned, a waiting car, falsified documents, a new name for her. But I discovered the plan before they could execute it." Isabella remembered the last entries in Helen's diary, the hasty and desperate handwriting. The woman had tried to confront Victor, tried to give him a chance to explain, to change the course of this family curse together. But some chains are too heavy to be broken by goodwill. "I confronted her that night," said Victor, his eyes assuming a distant expression as if he were reliving the memory. "She was at the pool waiting for Michael, crying, begging me to let her go, saying she loved me, but that she couldn't stay with someone who carried so much blood on his hands, as if she could simply abandon me after everything we had shared." The pain in Victor's voice was genuine, but there was something distorted in it, an inability to understand why Helen wouldn't want to be a prisoner of his obsessive love. For him, love justified everything, including murder. "And Michael," he continued, "had the audacity to try to stop me. He came running when he heard Helen's screams, tried to pull me away from her, didn't leave me a choice." Isabella visualized the scene with terrifying clarity. Her father arriving to save Helen, finding Victor already transformed by possessive fury, the struggle that followed, probably near the pool, with Helen watching in horror as the two men confronted each other because of her. And then, the silence. Michael's body disappearing, never to be found again, and Helen realizing she had signed her own death sentence by trying to flee. "Helen became hysterical after that," said Victor, his voice assuming an almost nostalgic tone. "She couldn't stop screaming, accusing me, threatening to tell the police. I tried to calm her down, tried to make her understand that everything I had done was out of love. But she was beyond reason." He continued slowly. "She jumped into the pool, trying to swim away from me. But I followed her, and when I finally reached her, when I tried to pull her out of the water, she fought against me with all her strength." The silence that followed was laden with horrible implications. Isabella didn't need to hear the details to understand what had happened. Helen had drowned not by suicide, but during a desperate struggle to escape the man who claimed to love her. And Michael had been killed trying to protect her, his body probably buried somewhere remote on the property. "Now you understand," said Victor, approaching dangerously. "That's why I isolated myself all these years. That's why I avoided getting involved with women. I knew that if I found someone with the right characteristics, with that specific combination of innocence and strength that awakens something uncontrollable in me, the story would repeat itself." "But then you appeared," he continued, extending his hand as if he wanted to touch her face. "With the same eyes as Helen, the same vulnerability disguised as courage, daughter of the man who tried to prevent me from having what was mine by right. It was as if fate was giving me a second chance, an opportunity to do everything right this time." The madness in Victor's words was evident. He truly believed that he had been betrayed by Helen and Michael, that he had been the victim in that situation. In his distorted mind, he deserved to be loved unconditionally, and any attempt to abandon him was a betrayal that justified violence. Isabella understood that she was dealing not just with a murderer, but with someone completely disconnected from reality. "You're going to stay with me," he said, not as a question or request, but as a statement of fact. "You're going to learn to love me the right way, without questioning, without trying to run away. I can be different this time, Isabella. I can control my nature if you don't give me reasons to lose you." The promise sounded like a mortal threat, and Isabella knew she had only one opportunity to escape. Victor was approaching slowly, confident that she was paralyzed by fear and revelation. But he had underestimated something important about her. Unlike Helen, who had grown up in a protected and comfortable life, Isabella had been forged by adversity, by the need to be strong even when the world conspired against her. When he extended his hand to touch her, she didn't back away. Instead, she pretended to accept the touch, letting him get close enough to lower his guard. And then, with all the strength she could gather, she pushed the container with the evidence against his chest and ran toward the forest, knowing her life depended on reaching the road before he caught up with her. Victor's angry shouts echoed behind her, mixed with the noise of his heavy footsteps pursuing her through the darkness. But Isabella ran not just for her life, she ran for the memory of her father, for the justice that Helen had never received, and for the chance to definitively break the cycle of violence that had haunted that property for too many generations. The forest closed around Isabella like a dark cathedral, the branches of the trees intertwining above her head and almost completely blocking the moonlight. She ran blindly between the trunks, stumbling on roots and being whipped by low branches, but without slowing down. Behind her, she could hear Victor's heavy footsteps approaching, accompanied by his labored breathing and occasional curses when he too stumbled on natural obstacles. Adrenaline burned in her veins like acid, keeping her moving even when her lungs screamed for air. Every sound of the forest terrified her, the cracking of branches, the rustling of leaves, the distant hooting of an owl, because all could be masking the footsteps of her pursuer. She tried to orient herself by the stars visible through the tree canopy, remembering that the main road was in the northeast direction from the property. Victor was no longer trying to be subtle in his pursuit. His voice echoed among the trees, alternating between desperate pleas and veiled threats. "Isabella, you don't need to be afraid of me," he shouted, his voice distorted by distance and dense vegetation. "I would never hurt you. You're different from the others, special. We can start again, we can be happy together." But she had seen the truth in his eyes, had recognized the same obsessive madness that had killed Helen and her father. Victor's words were those of a man who had completely lost touch with reality, someone who genuinely believed that murder could be justified by love. She could not and would not surrender to that delusion. When she finally spotted the distant lights of the road through the trees, Isabella felt an explosion of hope. But hope quickly turned to despair when she realized that Victor had changed direction, cutting through a clearing to intercept her before she could reach safety. He knew that property better than she did, knew all the shortcuts and secret paths. She abruptly changed course, following a stream she had found by chance, hoping that the water would mask her footsteps and confuse Victor about her location. The icy water soaked her shoes and made each step more difficult, but she persisted, using the slippery stones as support as she followed the current downstream. It was when she was crossing a deeper part of the stream that she heard the silence. Victor had stopped shouting, had stopped making noise. Somehow, This was even more terrifying than the noisy pursuit. It meant that he had changed tactics, that he was being more calculating in his hunt. Isabella crouched behind a large rock, trying to control her labored breathing and listen for any sound that might indicate where he was. The attack came from a completely unexpected direction. Victor had circled behind her, using the sound of the water to mask his own movements. She only realized his presence when she felt his hands grabbing her shoulders, violently pulling her out of the water. The scream that escaped her throat echoed through the forest like the lament of a wounded animal. "Enough running," he said, his voice hoarse with effort and frustration. "You're only making things more difficult for both of us." Isabella fought against his grip, trying to free herself, but he was much stronger. His hands left painful marks on her arms as he held her, and there was a barely contained violence in his movements that suggested his patience was rapidly running out. "Why can't you understand?" he asked, shaking her slightly. "I love you, Isabella. I love you more than I loved any of the others. You could have everything with me, could live like a queen in that house. Why do you prefer to run away to a life of misery and loneliness?" "Because you're a murderer," she screamed, finding courage in her anger. "Because you killed innocent people, including my father. Because your love isn't love, it's sick possession. You don't love anyone, Victor. You just want to possess, control, destroy." The truth of her words hit Victor like physical slaps. His expression went through a series of emotions: surprise, hurt, anger, and finally a deadly coldness that made Isabella realize she had crossed a dangerous line. His hands moved to her neck, not yet with enough force to hurt her, but as a clear warning of what could happen. "You're talking like Helen," he said, his voice assuming a dangerously low tone. "She also said that I didn't know how to truly love, that I was too possessive, too violent. But she was wrong, just as you are wrong. What I feel for you women is pure. It's absolute. It's the kind of love that most people never experience in their entire lives." Isabella could feel the pressure of his fingers gradually increasing around her neck. There was a strange serenity in Victor's expression now, as if he had reached an internal resolution that filled her with terror. She realized she had reached the critical moment, that he was deciding between taking her back as a prisoner or eliminating her right there in the forest. "If I can't have you," he murmured, more to himself than to her, "then at least I won't have to see you with another man. I won't have to imagine you being touched by hands that aren't mine, being loved by someone who isn't me." Complete madness had taken hold of him. Isabella could see in Victor's eyes that he had crossed the final line, that the rational part of his mind had been consumed by obsession. She had only seconds before he made an irreversible decision. It was then that she heard the sound of sirens in the distance, rapidly approaching the property. The lights of police cars cut through the darkness of the forest, and voices amplified by loudspeakers echoed among the trees. Mrs. Shelby, concerned that Isabella hadn't returned to the guest house, had called the police when she found signs of struggle in Helen's room. Victor heard the sounds too, and his expression transformed again. The arrival of the police had completely changed the dynamics of the situation. He could no longer simply kill Isabella and hide the body as he had done with Michael. There were too many people looking for her, too many witnesses to her presence on the property. "They're going to separate us," he said, his voice assuming a desperate tone. "They're going to take me away. They're going to make you testify against me. You're going to tell them about Helen, about your father, about everything we discovered today. And I'll never see you again." The sirens were getting closer, and Isabella could see the lights of helicopters cutting through the night sky. Victor released her neck and pulled her against his chest, embracing her with an intensity that was simultaneously protective and possessive. She could feel his tears wetting her hair, could hear the sobs he tried to stifle. "I really do love you," he whispered in her ear. "I know you don't believe it. I know you think I'm just a monster, but everything I did, every terrible decision I made was because I can't live without the people I love. It's a weakness, I know, but it's who I am." There was a devastating sincerity in those words, a vulnerability that momentarily made Victor human again. Isabella realized that he truly believed he was being moved by love, that he had found a way to justify his crimes through a distorted logic that made sense only to him. The voices of the police were very close now, and Victor knew he had only minutes before being captured. He looked at Isabella with an expression that mixed love, despair, and a strange resignation. "Promise me one thing," he said. "When they take me away, when they judge me for what I did, Remember that there was a moment when we were both happy together. Remember that not everything was a lie." The police found Isabella and Victor standing in the middle of the clearing, embracing like two lovers who had decided to face the end of the world together. The powerful flashlights created a circle of light around them, transforming the dark forest into a theatrical stage where the final tragedy would be played out. Victor didn't resist when the officers approached with their guns pointed. He simply released Isabella gently as if she were made of crystal and raised his hands in surrender. "I'm not going to hurt her," he said calmly to the police, his voice recovering part of the aristocratic composure he had lost during the pursuit. "She's safe. She always was safe with me." Isabella moved slowly away from him, still in a state of shock, unable to completely process everything that had happened in the last few hours. When she finally managed to speak, her voice came out as a hoarse whisper. "He killed my father," she said, the words coming out fragmented between sobs. "And he killed his wife. The bodies are hidden on the property. He confessed everything." The words caused an immediate commotion among the police. Victor was handcuffed and placed in a patrol car, but not before casting a final look at Isabella that she would never be able to forget. It wasn't the look of a defeated man, but of someone who sincerely believed he was being wronged by fate. The days that followed were a whirlwind of interrogations, testimonies, and revelations that completely transformed Isabella's understanding of her own life. The police found Michael's body buried in the garden of white roses that he himself had planted years before, in a cruel irony that didn't go unnoticed by the investigators. Helen was exhumed for a new autopsy, which confirmed that she had died by drowning, but with signs of struggle that had been ignored in the original investigation. The press seized the story with veracity, transforming it into a sensationalist narrative about obsessive love, murder, and family secrets. Isabella found herself at the center of a media storm that she wasn't prepared to face. Reporters camped outside the boarding house where she was staying, trying to get exclusive interviews about her experience with the Mountain Killer, as Victor had been nicknamed by the tabloids. It was during this chaotic period that Isabella met Dr. Eleanor Mitchell, a forensic psychologist specializing in cases of domestic violence and love obsession. Eleanor had been assigned to help Isabella process the trauma and prepare her testimony for the trial, but quickly became much more than a professional therapist. She became the anchor that Isabella needed to avoid drowning in the emotional storm that her life had become. Eleanor helped Isabella understand that what she had experienced with Victor wasn't love, despite the emotional and physical intensity she had felt. It was a sophisticated form of psychological manipulation, a technique that emotional predators used to create seemingly deep bonds with their victims. The initial charm, the calculated vulnerability, the creation of a sense of shared destiny, all were part of a pattern that Victor had perfected over the years. "You weren't naive or foolish," Eleanor explained during one of their sessions. "You were the victim of someone extremely skilled in emotional manipulation. Victor studied you, identified your vulnerabilities, and built a persona specifically designed to attract you. The fact that you managed to escape shows extraordinary inner strength." But the most shocking revelations came when the investigation delved into the history of the Caldwell family. The documents found in the secret passage led investigators to discover a network of crimes that extended for generations. It wasn't just the young women who had disappeared. There were also male employees who had tried to protect them, neighbors who were too curious, and even members of the family itself who had questioned the patterns of behavior. The mountain property was transformed into an active crime scene, with forensic teams systematically excavating the gardens in search of more bodies. They found 5 skeletons in different locations on the property, all of young women, buried with personal belongings that allowed partial identifications. Each discovery added more weight to the case against Victor and revealed the real extent of the curse that had haunted that land for decades. During this period, Isabella received a letter from Victor from prison. At first, she refused to read it, but Eleanor encouraged her to do so as part of her healing process. The letter was long and detailed, a final attempt by Victor to explain his actions and justify his crimes. But as she read it, Isabella realized something that deeply shocked her. Victor was lying, even to himself. The letter was full of contradictions, of alternative versions of events that corresponded neither to what he had confessed in the forest, nor to the physical evidence found by the police. He had created a narrative in which he was simultaneously the villain and the victim, the executioner and the martyr of an impossible love. More disturbing still, the letter revealed that Victor had planned his meeting with Isabella long before she accepted the job. He had investigated Michael's family, discovered the existence of his daughter, and orchestrated the entire situation to attract her to the property. The job through Mrs. Shelby hadn't been a coincidence. Victor had manipulated the entire situation, using Isabella's financial need and her adoptive mother's religiosity to create the perfect circumstances for his plan. "I knew you would come," he wrote. "I knew you would feel the connection with this place, with your true origin. You belong here, Isabella, belong to me, and even now, even separated by bars and walls, I know you feel it too. The love we shared was real, was true, was greater than the circumstances that separate us now." Reading the letter was simultaneously enlightening and nauseating. Isabella finally understood that she had never had a real choice in the situation. From the moment she had stepped onto the property, perhaps even before she was born, she had been a piece in a much larger game, an obsession that transcended her own existence and connected with the death of her biological mother and the disappearance of her father. But understanding the manipulation was also liberating. It meant that the feelings she had experienced, although real in their intensity, weren't based on a genuine connection with Victor. They were the result of sophisticated psychological techniques applied by someone who had studied her vulnerabilities and deliberately created the conditions for her to fall in love. Eleanor helped Isabella separate what had been real from what had been fabricated. Her courage in confronting the truth about her father, her strength in escaping from Victor, her determination to see justice done. These were genuine characteristics that belonged entirely to her. The physical attraction she had felt, the sensation of shared destiny, the belief that Victor understood her soul, these were carefully constructed illusions. As the date of the trial approached, Isabella felt increasingly stronger and prepared to confront Victor in court. She had found her voice, had processed her trauma, and was determined to ensure that he paid for the crimes he had committed. But more important than legal justice was the emotional justice she had found for herself. She had broken the cycle. For the first time in generations, a woman had escaped the deadly obsession of the Caldwell family. She had survived not only physically, but emotionally intact, with her capacity to love and trust wounded, but not destroyed. And she was determined to use her experience to help other women who might find themselves in similar situations. The mountain property would be sold, the profits distributed among the families of the identified victims. The cycle of violence that had stained that land for so long would finally come to an end. And Isabella, who had arrived there as an innocent young woman looking for work, would leave as a strong woman, aware of her own strength and determined to build a life based on genuine choices, not on manipulations or others' obsessions. The courthouse was packed on the first day of Victor Caldwell's trial. The national press had transformed the case into a public obsession, and people traveled from all over the country to witness what promised to be one of the most sensational criminal trials of the decade. Isabella entered the building through a side entrance, escorted by security guards and accompanied by Eleanor, who had become not only her therapist, but a true friend and constant source of support. When Isabella saw Victor for the first time in months, she felt a shock that she hadn't fully anticipated. He was visibly thinner. The grey hair that before was just sparse strands now dominated his temple, and there was an unhealthy pallor to his skin that spoke of months without adequate sunlight. But the eyes remained the same, dark, intense, and fixed on her, with an intensity that made her shiver. The defense strategy became clear from the opening of the trial. Victor's lawyers didn't deny the murders, but argued that he suffered from a serious psychological disorder that compromised his ability to distinguish between love and obsession. They presented mental health experts who testified about personality disorders, childhood traumas, and the pathological nature of obsessive love. The prosecutor, in turn, painted a picture of a calculating predator who had used his intelligence and resources to manipulate and kill innocent women for decades. He meticulously presented the forensic evidence, the documents found on the property, and the testimonies of investigators who had discovered the real extent of the Caldwell family's crimes. When it came time for Isabella to testify, she walked to the witness stand with firm steps, aware that this moment would define not only Victor's fate, but also her own future. She had spent weeks preparing with Eleanor and with the prosecutors, reviewing every detail of her experience, every moment of manipulation she had suffered. Her voice was clear and firm when she began to tell her story. She described how she had arrived at the property, how Victor had systematically built an emotional connection with her, how he had used her vulnerability and curiosity to lure her into his trap. She omitted nothing, not the physical attraction she had felt, not the moments of apparent tenderness, not her own initial naivety. The most devastating testimony came when she described the night of the discovery of the truth. With a controlled but emotionally charged voice, Isabella told about finding the documents, about Victor's confession, about the pursuit through the forest. The courtroom was in absolute silence as she spoke, each person present absorbing the intensity of her experience. During the defense's interrogation, Victor's lawyers tried to suggest that Isabella had been a voluntary participant in the relationship, that she had encouraged his attentions and then changed her mind when she discovered the truth about his past. But Isabella was prepared for these attempts to blame the victim. "I was 21 and had never been kissed before I met him," she responded with dignity when questioned about her supposed complicity. "I had no experience with men, with relationships, with psychological manipulation." He deliberately exploited that innocence, using techniques he had perfected with other victims over the years. "There was nothing mutual or consensual about what happened to me." The most difficult part of the testimony came when the prosecutor asked her to look directly at Victor and describe what she had felt when she realized he was her father's murderer. Isabella turned to face him, and for a moment the two looked at each other across the crowded courtroom with the same intensity they had shared that first afternoon near the pool. "I felt like I had lost my father twice," she said, her voice breaking slightly for the first time. "Once when he disappeared from my life when I was a baby, and again when I discovered that the man I was falling in love with was responsible for his death. Victor had stolen from me not only my father, but also the possibility of ever knowing him, of having answers to questions that tormented me all my life." Victor listened to every word with an expression that mixed pain and something that could have been remorse. Occasionally he shook his head slightly, as if disagreeing with her interpretation of events, but never looked away from her. There was something hypnotic in that exchange of glances, a disturbing connection that hadn't been completely broken despite everything that had happened. When Victor's lawyers had their chance to present the defense, they called the defendant himself to testify. Victor climbed to the witness stand with the same aristocratic composure that Isabella remembered, wearing a dark suit that partially disguised his deteriorated appearance. When he began to speak, his voice had the same hypnotic quality that he had used to seduce her months before. He didn't deny the murders, but presented them as inevitable tragedies caused by a love that was too great to be contained. He spoke about Helen as if she were a martyr of their impossible love, about Michael as a tragic obstacle that had placed himself between them, and about Isabella he spoke with a passion that was simultaneously touching and terrifying. "I loved her from the first moment I saw her," he said, his eyes finding hers across the courtroom. "Not as a predator loves his prey, but as a man loves the woman who completes his soul. Everything I did, every decision I made, was motivated by that love. I may be sick, I may be wrong, but I never lied about my feelings." The sincerity in his voice was disturbing because it seemed genuine. Victor truly believed in his own version of events, truly saw his crimes as sacrifices made on the altar of true love. This fundamental disconnection from reality was perhaps more frightening than the violence itself, because it suggested that he would never be capable of true repentance or reform. During cross-examination, the prosecutor systematically dismantled Victor's romantic narrative, forcing him to admit the sordid aspects of his crimes. How he had manipulated Isabella from even before she accepted the job, how he had planned each interaction to maximize its emotional impact, how he had used her vulnerability and emotional needs against her. The most dramatic moment came when the prosecutor directly asked if Victor felt remorse for the murders. Victor was silent for a long moment, his eyes once again seeking Isabella in the audience. When he finally spoke, his response sent a chill through the courtroom. "I feel remorse for having caused pain to people who didn't deserve to suffer," he said slowly, "but I can't feel remorse for loving too intensely. If that makes me a monster, then I accept that condemnation. But I'd rather be a monster capable of absolute love than a normal man incapable of feeling anything deeply. The response revealed the complete extent of his pathology. Victor had transformed his inability to love healthily into a virtue, had romanticized his mental illness to the point where it became almost noble in his own mind. It was a form of narcissism so deep that it made any possibility of rehabilitation practically impossible. When the final arguments were presented, both the prosecution and the defense acknowledged that Victor was guilty of the crimes. The only real question was whether he would be sentenced to life in prison or be considered criminally insane and sent to a psychiatric hospital. For Isabella, both options represented justice, as long as he could never hurt another woman. She left the courthouse that day exhausted but relieved. She had confronted her abuser, had told her truth, had honored the memory of her father and Helen. The verdict would come in a few days, but regardless of the legal outcome, she knew that she had found her own form of justice through the courage to testify and the strength to survive. 2 years passed since the trial that condemned Victor Caldwell to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The jury had rejected the insanity defense, determining that despite his psychological disorders, he had demonstrated sufficient capacity for planning and manipulation to be considered legally responsible for his acts. For Isabella, the verdict had represented not only justice, but the possibility of finally closing a painful chapter of her life and beginning to write a new story. She had used the money from the sale of the Caldwell property, which had been destined for the families of the victims, to finance her studies in psychology. Inspired by her own experience and by the support she had received from Dr. Eleanor Mitchell, Isabella had decided to dedicate her life to helping other women who had survived abusive relationships and psychological manipulation. Now, at 24, she was about to graduate and had been accepted into a master's program specializing in trauma and recovery. Therapy with Eleanor had evolved into a deep and lasting friendship. Eleanor, who had amicably divorced her husband 2 years before, discovering her own sexual orientation late in life, had become much more than a professional mentor for Isabella. They had developed an emotional connection that grew slowly, based on mutual respect, shared understanding, and an emotional intimacy that neither had experienced before. The relationship had begun naturally, almost imperceptibly. Dinners after therapy sessions that extended for hours, conversations about literature and art that revealed deep affinities, walks through the parks of Boston where they had moved together. Eleanor had been careful to maintain professional boundaries until Isabella officially completed her therapy. But when they finally allowed themselves to explore their mutual feelings, they discovered a compatibility that went far beyond intellectual connection. Eleanor had taught Isabella that true love was based on free choice, mutual respect, and shared growth. It was the complete opposite of the possessive obsession that Victor had called love. With Eleanor, Isabella learned that real intimacy came from voluntary vulnerability, not manipulation or control. She learned that conflicts could be resolved through honest communication, that differences could be celebrated instead of eliminated, that healthy love created space for individual growth within the shared commitment. On that September morning, exactly 3 years after her first visit to the mountain property, Isabella woke up in the apartment she shared with Eleanor in a bohemian neighborhood of Boston. The sun entered through the wide windows, illuminating walls covered with books, plants, and photographs of their travels together across America. It was a space that reflected who they had become together: intellectuals, adventurers, passionate about life and committed to making a difference in the world. Eleanor was still sleeping beside her, her graying hair spread across the pillow, an expression of absolute peace on her face. At 42, she had found in Isabella not just a romantic companion, but an intellectual and emotional partner who challenged and inspired her daily. Together, they had established a clinic specializing in care for women survivors of violence, combining Eleanor's clinical experience with the unique perspective of someone who had survived extreme psychological manipulation. Isabella got up silently and walked to the kitchen to prepare coffee. While waiting for the water to boil, her eyes fixed on a letter that had arrived the previous week and that she still hadn't had the courage to open. The sender was the penitentiary where Victor was serving his sentence. He had written several letters over the years, all intercepted and forwarded through his lawyers. Isabella had read some in the beginning, always with therapeutic supervision as part of her healing process. But in recent months, she had decided she no longer needed that exposure. This letter, however, was different. It came accompanied by a note from the prison director, informing that Victor had been diagnosed with aggressive cancer, and that doctors estimated he would have at most 6 months to live. He had requested a last conversation with Isabella, claiming to have important information that could help other victims of similar crimes. Eleanor appeared in the kitchen wearing a silk robe, her hair messy from sleep, but her eyes already awake and concerned. She had noticed Isabella's tension in recent days, had noticed how she looked at the letter without opening it. "You need to do what's best for you," Eleanor said softly, embracing Isabella from behind and kissing her neck. "There's no right or wrong answer. If you feel you need to see him for closure, I support you. If you decide you've had enough closure, I support you too." Eleanor's wisdom and maturity always impressed Isabella. Unlike Victor, who had tried to make decisions for her, control her choices, Eleanor always encouraged her to trust her own intuition and make choices based on her own needs, not on the expectations or manipulations of others. After much reflection, Isabella decided to visit Victor one last time. Not for him, but for herself. She wanted to see herself before him as the strong and independent woman she had become. Wanted him to know that he had failed to destroy her, that his attempt to possess her had resulted in the opposite, in her complete liberation from any power he might have exercised over her. The visit happened on a rainy October afternoon. Isabella entered the prison visiting room accompanied by Eleanor and a lawyer, having taken all possible legal and emotional precautions. Victor was visibly ill, the once imposing body now consumed by disease, but his eyes remained intense, still trying to establish that hypnotic connection he had used so many times before. When he began to speak, trying once again to justify his actions and declare his eternal love, Isabella interrupted him with a firmness that visibly surprised him. "I didn't come here to listen to your apologies or your declarations of love," she said calmly. "I came here so you can see who I've become. I'm a psychologist. I work helping women who have survived men like you. I'm loved by someone who respects me, who celebrates my independence instead of trying to control it. I have a full, meaningful life, built on free choices." Victor observed her with an expression that mixed surprise, admiration, and something that could have been distorted pride. "You've become extraordinary," he murmured. "I always knew you would be special, always saw your potential." "I didn't become extraordinary because of you or in spite of you," Isabella responded. "I became extraordinary because I learned to love myself and to accept the healthy love of others. Because I learned the difference between obsession and true love. Because I survived and chose to use my survival to help other people." The conversation lasted only 20 minutes. Victor tried several times to regain control of the narrative, to transform the meeting into another opportunity for emotional manipulation. But Isabella had completely changed. She was no longer the vulnerable and isolated young woman he had known. She was an adult woman, aware of her own strength, protected by healthy relationships and a meaningful career. When she left the prison, Isabella felt a lightness she hadn't expected. She had confronted her past one last time and had emerged victorious. Victor would die alone with his crimes and his distorted justifications, but she would live surrounded by genuine love and real purpose. 3 months later, Eleanor proposed to Isabella during a trip to Maine, at the same sunset over the sea that had healed so many of Isabella's emotional wounds. They married in an intimate ceremony surrounded by friends, colleagues, and the family Isabella had chosen, because she had learned that true family isn't necessarily the one we're born into, but the one we choose, and that chooses us back. When Victor died in prison 6 months later, Isabella felt an unexpected sadness, not for him, but for the life he could have had if he had been capable of loving healthily. But that sadness lasted only a moment. She had a life to live, a wife to love, patients to help, and a bright future to build. The cycle of violence that had haunted the mountain property had definitely ended with her, and in its place she had planted seeds of healing and hope that would flourish for generations.